Welcome back to another video lecture on Python. In this series of videos, we will be covering some of the basic concepts of programming following from what we learned in lecture 1. The topics to be covered will include how we can accept a user or file input, common errors that you may encounter as you continue coding, and new data types such as Boolean, list, and dictionaries. You will notice that the code for this lesson and the subsequent lesson have all been uploaded onto Blackboard. This is for your reference and ease of following of the lecture. However, I would encourage you to open up a fresh Jupyter notebook and code and run these codes or type in these codes yourself so that you yourself know that you are able to run or code those concepts out. Without further ado, let's take a look at what we have in user and file inputs. So what are user inputs? User inputs are basically inputs that you request from the user. So for example, if you wanted to code for a scissors paper stone game, you will need to get whether the player chose scissors paper or stone, and user inputs is one way to do that. So there are basically two ways that you can place a value inside a variable. The first way you have already learned, which is by assignment. So we can actually assign the value of 1 to the variable apple and the value of 2 to the value or the variable orange. So the second way is then to obtain an input from the user of the program. And how do we do that? The keyword to use here is input, and whatever that you see inside the inverted comma, this is actually what we are asking the user. So when we run this line of code, what appears is what is your name, and we are waiting for the user to actually type in his or her name. This, whatever the user types in now, is going to be stored inside this variable called name. Do note that anytime that you take an input using this function, the value is always stored as a string. Thereafter, if you choose to print out whatever is stored inside this variable, you will see it coming out. So let's see this in action using a Jupyter notebook. So for example, if I type name, what is your name? So for example, if my name is Joel, I can type in Joel here and press enter, and we will see Joel coming up as well. Just to be clear, as I mentioned earlier, if you use the keyword type, we see that it is a string. And do note that, for example, if let's say the name is actually a number, so let's say I input a value 3, or maybe we change the question. Instead of what is your name, what is the number? And we select the number 3, and when we print out this value, we see that 3 is being selected or 3 is being printed. But do note that this variable is a string. It does not store the value as an integer or a float, even if the value is a number. So that brings us to the end of the section on user inputs. Let's move on to file inputs. In what situations do we use file inputs? File inputs come in very helpful when we want to take information from other files, meaning files that exist outside of your Python file, and we want to import them so that we can perhaps manipulate it. So of course, if you wanted to import a paragraph into Python, so you can always declare a string, type out the entire paragraph. But if you want to have a shortcut to do that, we can actually use file input. The first step is to first place the file in a location that is known to your program. We need to first find our working directory. So let's type out this code to help us identify our working directory, which is also the same location where all your .ipynb files are stored. So import OS, import refers to taking in a library that has certain functions that we want to use. So os.getWorkingDirectory, that provides us a certain location inside your computer. So if I copy this, do note that somehow Python will always use a double backslash because of a formatting, because it needs to format text in a certain way. So let's say we want to open up any file explorer, copy this in, and just remove the duplicates. And this brings us to the location where we call it your working directory. So now what we want to do is we want to open this file called review.txt. So you see this inside this folder, there's this file called review.txt, and there is actually a paragraph, a review of a certain product. So let's now go to Jupyter Notebook, and in order for us to take in a file, we use the keyword open, and we tell Python what is the name of the file. Do note that if you only include the name of the file, it must be placed in your working directory, which you can find here. Next, you tell it that you want to read the file, therefore is R, and .read actually converts it into a string that is going to be placed inside this variable f. So if I run this line and I run check what is inside f, we see the same review that we saw inside the notepad earlier. There are some differences. We see that there's this /n, /n. This is actually a line break, meaning we're moving to the next line, but Python represents it as \n. Another thing to note, do we always need to, is it always R? Do we need to include this? There are other parameters that you can put into this value. R is for read, W is for write, and there are a few others. If you do not include this R, the default, it will still work because the default is actually read. So if we do that and we open up G, we see that we get the same thing. For some of you who are using a Mac, you may run into issue because MacBooks may not be able to read the apostrophe or single quotation mark. All you need to do is go to the text file and remove all the apostrophe or single quotation mark, save it, close it, and then run that line again. It should work. So now we also know how we can actually import text files into our Python program. Aside from text files, there are also other file formats that Python can take in values from, including Excel or CSV. But instead of the keyword open that we saw earlier, the keyword will be something different. You can always Google to find out more. Values that are taken into Python, they can be manipulated accordingly. It is nothing more than a string. And we have also covered a new library called OS. So that's the first time that we are exposing you to importing of a library. So that is something that we have also covered in this section. So that brings us to the end of our introduction. Please proceed to the next video where we will cover the concept of errors.